given the huge amount of interest in this panel discussion, we're going to get started right away. I'd like to start by welcoming everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Climate Adaptation Research for BC Agriculture virtual workshop. My name is Kirsten Hannum. I'm a researcher with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, based at the Summerland Research and Development Centre. I work in the fields of soil, water, and crop management for climate change adaptation and resilience, primarily in tree fruits. This panel will look at 4 producers' perspectives from the dairy, berry, ranching, and tree fruit sectors on the extreme heat and drought experienced across the province this past summer. For the first hour or so, I will be introducing and posing questions to the panelists, and then we will reserve the final 20 minutes or so for questions from the audience. To pose a question, please type it into the Q&A box. You can see that at the bottom kind of left-hand part of your screen. And feel free to upvote questions that particularly interest you to help us prioritize which questions we pose to our panelists in the event that we don't have time for all the questions. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists and posing each of them our first question. And after that, we'll move around the panel with various questions. We're hoping to have some time at the end of the hour and a half to pose questions to the panelists that you propose. So our first panelist today is Amrit Brar. Amrit is, at 28 years old, our youngest panel. He's a 3rd-generation berry farmer in the Lower Mainland. His dad and uncle started KN Berry Farms in the mid-70s, and Amrit is now taking over. He and his family farm raspberries and blueberries on both sides of the Canada-US border. Amrit, for our first question, we'd like to know, as a berry grower, was there anything that really surprised you during the extreme heat and/or drought this summer?
For us, it was more on how long the heat lasted and how hot it actually got and how strong the UV was. We didn't expect the UV to be as strong as it was, and especially with the night temperatures and how high they were, the plants didn't get any chance to actually get any rest. So they were just pretty much on go mode all day and all night. And the heat lasted for about 3 days, which did a lot of damage to the plants.
That's really interesting, Amrit. I've heard from other growers that those nighttime temperatures where the temperatures really just didn't cool down was particularly damaging. So that's interesting to hear. Our next panelist is Molly. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I mean, because usually at night when the temperature drops, the plants get some sort of a break where they can rest and be ready for the next day. But with the heat being that high, like temperatures still at 20 degrees, 21, 22 at night, the plants had no break.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think all of us kind of felt that at night ourselves too, berries and people.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll turn it over to our next panelist then, but we'll come back to you with more questions soon, Amrit. Our next panelist is Molly Thurston. Molly is co-owner and operator of Claremont Ranch Organics, a certified organic orchard in Lake Country, BC. Claremont Ranch produces apricots, peaches, apples, and pears. Molly holds a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture from the University of Guelph and a Master's of Science from UBC Okanagan. She's a professional agrologist and has worked with tree fruit growers in the Okanagan Valley for the past 16 years. Her company, Pearl Agricultural Consulting, Inc., is focused on promoting innovation and providing agronomic support to tree fruit growers and packers in the Okanagan and Kootenay regions. Molly, we'd like to ask you the same question. As a producer of tree fruit, was there anything that really surprised you during the extreme heat and drought this summer?
Thanks, Kirsten. And it's nice to see so many colleagues on the line already joining us. So I'm sure you'll all have lots to chime in on. But some of the things that were most surprising to me, I would echo what Amrit said, just the extent of the wilting and then the subsequent damage and burning to leaves, fruit, as well as the wood. certainly in the different exposed canopies that we had, we saw different types of damage. And that was surprising. I think it was also very surprising to see what came out of post the heat dome. We had a lot of insect pressure, and we also saw many pests either have additional generations or additional partial generations of pests, or an increased intensity and volume of pests. So I thought that was quite interesting, and maybe we can talk more about that as we go through the discussion. But another sideline is just my own water usage. I just received my annual irrigation consumption report, and I'm incredibly surprised by how much additional water I use this season. And so I think that's something I'm really quite curious to hear from the other producers on as well.
All really interesting points, Molly. Yeah, I think that hearing from all our panelists and members of the audience as well, it will be interesting to hear those kind of effects on pests and resource use, particularly water. So thank you. Okay, our third panelist is Mark Ricca. Mark's grandparents began dairy farming in Chilliwack, BC in 1915. Thus, his family has been producing healthy food in the same community for over 100 years. Brook Nook Farms is a family-run local business. Mark is the third generation to work the farm his grandfather started back in 1915. Today, they milk 250 cows on more than 140 acres they own and another 65 they rent. Mark is proud to work closely with his family and is passionate about investing in the future for the next generation. And that's particularly acute in the strange circumstances we're experiencing these days. Mark, I'm going to ask you the same question I posed to Amrit and Molly. As a dairy farmer, was there anything that really surprised you during the extreme heat and drought this summer?
Well, I was surprised how early the heat came, late June. Usually, you get some heat waves in end of July, August, but it was definitely hard on the animals coming that soon. They're not quite prepared. They haven't adapted to that heat yet. And like Armory was saying, how the night temperatures never drop. So usually, even if it gets up to 35 degrees during the day, if it drops below 20 at night, the cows get a chance to recharge, and then they do better the next day. But in those crazy nighttime temperatures of 28, 29, 30 degrees, they have no time to recharge. And also with the drought, I know we always experience drought in July and August, but it was just so early this year. Like May and June was extremely dry, so that just made it that much more harder on the plants to produce later on in the season.
That's interesting, Mark. So we're definitely seeing a few common themes here. That lack of rest in the evening seems to be particularly worrisome, whether you're an animal producer or you're relying on plant crops. Yeah.
And also like what Molly said about, sorry to interrupt, but also what Molly said about increased water usage. That was huge on our farm because we do have soakers to keep the cows cool, and bigger electricity bill because we had a lot of fans moving the whole time too. So.
And have you received information already about how much water you used this summer so you can compare it with last year?
Well, we are on well on the farm.
Okay.
So, I mean, I have the numbers of how much water we pulled out, but it's a lot more.
Yeah, I believe it. Interesting. Okay. I think we'll now turn to our final panelist to join us today, and that's Doug Fossen. Doug is the owner-operator of Fossen's Bar 7 Ranch, which was started in 1976 by Ed and Louise Fossen. The ranch is located in Rock Creek, BC, on 2,300 deeded acres. The ranch utilizes a mixture of private, leased, and government rangeland of approximately 50,000 acres to supply the herd of 370 cows with their grazing needs. So Doug, I'm sure you're not surprised by this question, having heard me ask it 3 times already, but as a rancher, was there anything that surprised you during the extreme heat and drought this summer? We can't quite hear you yet, Doug. I'm hoping
is
the
my
phone
phone
works
muted?
to get us through. Oh, I hear you now. Yeah.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
Not sure if it's coming through the phone or the, yeah, the biggest thing we noticed on ours farm growing our crops was that we, the varieties that we chose for the year made a big difference. I messed up on a triticale variety, and it didn't handle the heat very well, as well as our corn did well in our freshly seeded alfalfa, but the older hay fields just could not handle the heat, even with water. And then on our grazing end of it, our cattle used a lot more of the forested grass. So that's on most years kind of the lower quality grass, like pine grass that grows in the trees, but they sort of stayed out of the hot open country where they would normally hit on a normal year, and moved more into those trees. So they did quite well, but they were forced to eat grasses that they don't normally consume.
That is really interesting and kind of touches on some things I've heard from growers outside this panel, that diversity in varieties or crop types kind of helped in some ways, because if some didn't do very well in the heat, others might have. So that's an interesting comment. I see Molly would like to add something about the varieties to add to Doug's comment. Doug, did you want to have anything to add before we turn it over to Molly again?
No, that's great. Go ahead, Molly.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Doug. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Doug, because that was also really interesting for us in the tree fruit side of things, particularly on the cherry side of the crop, that we noticed a lot of damage in our early cherry varieties. And I think part of it was stage of crop development, and lesser damage as we got into later season varieties, which maybe were more immature or earlier stages at the time of the heat dome. So varieties seem to play a big role, as well as within the different types of trees, we saw quite distinctive damage occurring. And I was surprised on our farm that my entire apricot crop ripened probably about 3 weeks early, fell off the trees before I could even harvest. And yet the peaches were one of the best crops I've seen in years. And so definitely some major differences, but particularly on the cherry side, we saw some distinct varietal differences.
And so just one more comment, if I can add. Please like do. I think that's where I went to Olds College for 2 years, and that having that education where you can see variety differences, I think that's a real important thing for our future producers. We're getting into more advanced agriculture, whether we know it or not, and knowing those little tricks of what the difference between a dwarf barley and a forage barley. If you don't know that, you could really get hurt on a year like this.
So our answers to this question from all 4 panelists are really revealing. There's some unique challenges that each sector experienced, but there's also some really common ground we see here, whether it's dramatic increases in water use, strength in diversity, and having a variety of options. If one variety or crop does better than another under this heat, we're seeing some real difficulties with the fact that temperatures didn't cool overnight, and that presented challenges whether you were growing raspberries or dairy cattle. So already this presents us with some really interesting information that hopefully we can take into the future to learn from and help us prepare and adapt. The next question I have, I'd like to present to Amrit. Amrit, I'd like to know how you adapted in the moment to the challenges posed by that extreme heat and drought. Were there any the heat dome that help your crops survive while it was happening?
At that time, we did prepare beforehand. We did see the heat coming. We did sow our mounds. We do grow our raspberries and blueberries on mounds, and we had our irrigation running pretty much 24 hours, 7 days a week. Even before the heat, we saw it coming, so we tried to get as much moisture as we could into the mound and into the roots, so that the plants would have some sort of a chance. But what really did a lot of damage for us was the UV, because the UV was so strong, it kind of burnt a lot of the tips, and it burnt a lot of the fruit that was on the plants at that time.
So tools that could help you deal with that UV in the future might be really helpful.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Like, we do know growers in California use shade cloth and stuff like that to shade the plants when heat like this does come. But one thing that was unique to our area was the UV. Like, most places do hit 40, 50 degrees, like Arizona, Texas, California, but they don't get the UV that we got.
Okay, interesting. So looking broadly for tools that are deployed elsewhere might be helpful to some degree, but still this was a pretty unique situation.
Yeah, it's very unique. And the way we grow our crops is kind of different, right? A lot of the other guys, they're more hand harvest, where we're more mechanical and we use harvesters. And for us to put shade cloth and like that stuff like that around the field would be very hard to get our harvesters through the field.
Okay, that's interesting, because I have heard shade cloth discussed for other crops, but I can see that the practicalities of deploying something like that could be tricky in your situation. And I'm also struck that one of the tools you deployed to survive this event really relied on access to water. So I can imagine that that's something that our other panelists could probably support. Molly, I'm going to turn the same question over to you and ask, when this was happening, how did you adapt or change your practices in any way to help your crops get through?
I think, we were very concerned about the dry soil conditions heading into the season. And part of the work I do with other producers is extension meetings. And we'd had meetings in both April and May about the drought conditions and the potential for a really dry season. And I think, that at that time we were feeling like we probably would need to start up irrigation earlier in the season than we thought we might. So that preemptive watering and just trying to kind of get to field capacity and have access to water heading into the heat dome was really important. I mean, that being said, I think, echoing what the other panelists have said, is we just couldn't keep up. And, and that's evident in both, our systems as well as in the water usage. And some growers had access in fruit crops to overhead cooling systems, which would basically be impact sprinklers or misters that are above the canopy, and tried to use that in order to decrease canopy temperatures, and also tried to utilize irrigation or cooling throughout the evening and the nighttime. But as we discussed, with those high 20s, it really didn't help us to cool the crop a whole lot. One of the things I did in my own orchard was leave the cover crop as long as possible. We avoided mowing as much as possible. Made the orchard a bit of a jungle and difficult to get through, but it also helped, I think, to retain some moisture, and also to provide us with a bit of, temperature moderation when the temperatures did finally cool down later in the season. It was difficult to get ahead of it. And I think, Emrit shared some interesting ideas with the crop cover there. And some of my grower clients have crop cover systems and did deploy those and were able to utilize them to combat particularly the sunburn and the UV damage that Amrit mentioned. Unfortunately, we didn't have that opportunity in a lot of other orchards. So in those cases, we were relying heavily on water, which was our most available tool, I guess, is really it. But yeah, the preparation, I think, you know, we were all very surprised by how intense the heat was, how intense the UV damage tended to be. So lots of lessons learned this year, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. That's really interesting. I mean, there's some options provided that you have water, it sounds like, but there's still, perhaps we need to investigate some more tools to prepare, because it sounds from Farron's work that we can expect this to happen again. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you now and ask you the same question. When this heat event and drought was happening, were there any tools that you were able to deploy that were particularly effective, or even you found didn't work to help your dairy cattle survive? I just need you to turn your microphone on. Perfect.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
No, what I was saying was, fortunately, in 2019, we built a new dairy facility, and we put in a lot of fans for air movement, really tall sidewalls, 12 feet sidewalls with curtains to let airflow go through. We have a big 4-foot ridge vent on top, so all the heat generated from the cows can escape from the top of the barn. Now, we also put a heavy soaker rail in where the cows stand and eat, which is on a timer. So every 35 seconds, the soaker turns on for about 20 seconds and just completely soaks the cows. And then the fans kind of blow over top of them and keep them cool. So luckily, we had that already in place for when this heat came. So it was a huge plus for our cows.
I'm amazed at your good planning to prepare for this.
Like I said, it was just fortunate that we had put that on beforehand. And after we had installed it during that heat wave, we had quite a few producers come over and look at the new setup, because obviously they were suffering through that heat. So they're trying to find ways to keep their cows cool. Not only keep them cool, but somewhat keep production up too. Because when cows lose that much production, it's hard to get them back up.
Yeah, I believe it. It takes us a long time to recover, so I
Exactly,
can only imagine with a dairy cow.
One other thing I want to mention is we bought a second property in 2015, and that's where we built the new facility. And it's about 65, 70 acres, but there's no drainage on that farm. And our other farm has full drainage. And when we first moved here, we were anticipating on putting drainage into this farm too, just because to be able to get on the fields sooner in the spring. But what we found since 2015, we've been having these more drier seasons, that without having that drainage, without that water being drained out of the land, like in the spring, it retains in the soil, and our crops grow a lot better because we don't have irrigation on either farms. That's something we're gonna have to look into, but our crops grow a lot better on the farm that's not drained. So that might be something to look into in the future. You know, instead of pulling water out of the ground, just utilize the water that falls in the wintertime. And if it stays in the soil, you know, the plants could take it up throughout the dry season.
Again, Mark, that's a really interesting observation. So problems that you think are issues on a site that used to be considered a problem, such as lack of drainage, suddenly become an asset, and vice versa.
Yeah. And you know, with nowadays with water resources being limited, it might be a good way to, you know, like I said, utilize rainfall.
Yeah, plan ahead and capture that water and make sure you got it available. Really interesting. Great points again. Doug, I think we've still got you. So I'm going to pose the same question to Doug because, and partly you've answered this a little bit, Doug, in your mention of the different varieties of grasses and the fact that the cattle could hide under the trees. But I'm curious to know if there were other tools and tricks that you were able to deploy to help you survive through this season and make sure that you made it through the other side.
Like Mark, we've done our investment over the last probably 10 or 15, well, 10 or 15, probably 40 years. We put in some dams for water storage on our creeks that we irrigate out of. And then we've also improved our irrigation by going from handline systems to pivot irrigation systems. So we used the environmental farm plan, and we started about 10 years ago putting in pivots. So what that did was pumps that usually had to run 7 days a week on a normal year, we were down to running 2 to 3 days a week. And in these hot, dry times, that gave us a capacity when we needed a little bit more water or we needed to go over the crops more often. We had that capacity to cover them more quickly. So irrigation efficiencies really paid off. And then we've also invested heavily in watering, like off-site watering, water troughs. Wherever we can find a little spring of water, we develop it into a water trough. And that really helped late in the season when all the springs and creeks were starting to dry up. We still had water for our cattle. And there's maybe one other, it's more of back to a challenge, but one of our biggest challenges was the amount of wildlife we dealt with this year. We were really hammered with elk and deer just because there was nothing else green and our crops looked pretty tasty.
Yeah, I can imagine that the wildlife is looking for the same kinds of things that your cattle are looking for. So I can see that would be particularly an intense competition this year. Really interesting point. There's certainly some common themes amongst all four of you here, and in particular, water is a biggie. Either planning for the future so that it's ready and available when you need it, deploying it in new and in different ways, for example, for overhead cooling or for spraying your cattle down to help them cool down, creating dams or designing barns so that you're ready in the future. Those are all really interesting points. And it raises another question that was farther down my list for me, but I'd like to turn it over to any of you who'd like to answer. And the environmental farm plan, for example, was raised as useful for helping you to prepare over the last several years. And I wondered if there are any other programs or supports that you found particularly useful during this summer or had been particularly effective in helping you prepare, because several of you made the comment you've been getting ready for this for several years. Would any of you like to take that question?
I would just add programs that we've used, the Environmental Farm Plan program, which I mentioned already, and another good program was the SARPL program, which is Species at Risk Partnerships on Agriculture Land. And that was a good program that we were able to do some grazing management, fencing, and riparian exclusion, watering sort of deals.
That's a great one, Doug. And I wasn't even aware of that program. So thanks. If somebody, maybe I'll just put in a little plug to Shauna. Maybe if you can hunt it down and put the link in the chat for people, they might be interested in checking it out. Okay, so we heard about SARPL. We heard about the Environmental Farm Plan. Did anyone else find any of the programs or resources useful? Molly, I wondered if maybe you found that growers were looking to BC DAS, for example, increasingly this summer.
Absolutely, Kirsten. I think, within the tree fruit industry, we're using the decision aid system, and there was certainly lots of discussion about monitoring weather and utilizing the climate stations that are located in the orchards to be able to access max and mint data, as well as utilizing some of the models. We do have a sunburn model on the DAS system. Unfortunately, I think there were several questions I think in the chat, and I'm sorry I haven't been following them super closely, but there were a lot of questions about, how did we use sprayable products, for example, on tree fruits to decrease the amount of damage. And my colleague Sarah, I think, responded, we didn't see a great effect on that. And I think one of the big issues for us with tree fruits, particularly apples, was the stage that the apples were at. Often when the apples are about the size of a golf ball is when they're most at risk for sunburn damage, and that hit right about mid to end of June. So really crop timing and stage again was really important to the types of damage that we saw. But the DAS system provided a lot of good support both in the disease and insect modeling side of things. And that's also where, it was really interesting to look at the trends year over year from sort of my side of things, where we were seeing, the risk of a potential additional generation of some of the pests coming, which we haven't in the past. Like Doug and Mark, I've also used the environmental farm plan for management on our farm, and as well as over the last sort of 10 years, we've been upgrading our irrigation system, putting in micro sprinklers, trying to get onto timers, getting away from a lot of the hand mover impact sprinklers that we used to use that were putting out a lot more volume and certainly losing a lot more to evapotranspiration. We've also used the environmental farm plan to manage our wood waste in the orchard, be able to, chop up the wood waste and return it to the soil, which I think there was a question about, and I'm sorry, don't recall what it was, but that is a practice that we're doing, and just trying to kind of keep up with our mowing and mulching of material back into the orchard to add organic matter, and ideally feeding the soil that way. So environmental farm plan's been really effective. And on one of my new farms that I operate in, the Kootenays, it's also offered me the opportunity to look at some unique irrigation monitoring systems, and I'm hoping that we'll implement those in the future, which will be much more sort of drip oriented type systems. So it's been a great program for us as well.
Thanks, Molly. Those are, as always, some awesome additional points. And I'm going to have a couple follow-up questions, but before I do, I'd like to turn it over to Mark and Amrit. Are there any other additional programs or resources or training that you found was really helpful?
Well, we have the BC Dairy Association, and they're always sending out information, emails about things you could do for crops and, cow management when it comes to heat stress. So that was quite helpful.
Thanks, Mark. That's great.
Oh, one other thing I'd like to add, I would actually like to see maybe some government grants come out that would help producers, like if they're looking into putting in irrigation that's like water efficient, that would be better for the environment. If there would be grants you could get to like install those new systems that would reduce water usage, and even like power usage, like for us with our fans and stuff, you could use more power efficient fans to reduce your electricity. I think that'd be a great program if there could be grants like that.
Awesome, Mark. You anticipated my next question, which was, were there some gaps or areas that we would like to fill? So that's great. And I think it's a really interesting point, especially since everyone on the panel has mentioned how important access to water was, and how much more you needed to use this summer. Amrit, I'm just going to turn it over to you quickly to see if there was anything you wanted to add with regard to resources or training or guidance that was particularly useful to you, and or were there gaps that you think you'd like to see filled in the future? I think Amrit's joining us from the field, so he may be having a difficult time unmuting. But Amrit, if you do manage to just speak up, interrupt us, we want to hear from you. But in the meantime, maybe we'll move on to the next question. So Mark started that. Oh, there he is. Amrit, I see you've unmuted.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I was like, yeah, for us, it was just more like we reached out to growers more down south, like in California and Texas, and asked them what they do or what we can do to prepare our plants before the heat. Really, that was all that we could really do, just because we did run overhead irrigation as much as we could. We ran our drip tape as much as we could. We prepared the best we could. It was just the plants, the genetics behind the plants were not built for this kind of heat.
That's interesting. And again, you're in a really unique position, having operations on both sides of the border. So I can imagine that you probably have a lot of discussions with our southern neighbors, which could be really useful. And once again, you're raising some great points. Maybe there are practices down south that we could learn from or adapt to our realities here. And maybe there are crops or varieties that we could be considering growing up here that work well under warmer or hotter, drier conditions, that we could consider growing up here if we start those conversations with our southern neighbors. So again, maybe access to resources and training for increased power and water efficiency would be useful, and maybe some interesting conversations with growers in the US that have been more used to these warmer temperatures and drier conditions, and trying to understand how they could adapt and how they have adapted and what we could learn from them. Okay, how are we doing for time? Is there anything anybody would like to add? I'm just going to scramble quickly and look for my next question.
Can I add on the variety piece? Like, I think this is a really interesting discussion, and one that our industry needs to have, because we've also, it's not necessarily the variety, but it's the rootstocks that we're using that are very dwarfing. And I think this goes again back to Doug's point about dwarfing cultivars and some of the risks here. We've designed new orchard systems, and I've done it myself with, dwarf rootstocks, the potential being easier labor and management, but the risk maybe being less canopy, more exposure. The fruit hangs on the outside of that canopy rather than being, covered by leaves underneath, where they maybe are going to avoid some of the UV or some of those damaging heat effects we saw this year. Also, some of these rootstocks are really shallow rooted. So are they accessing the same amount of water? What's the, where are they able to get to in the soil, and how much are they accessing in terms of water, as well as nutrients that might move in water or be held in the soil in those areas. So, I'm wondering, I've had a few discussions with colleagues around the kitchen table lately, is, in these conditions, have we done ourselves a bit of a disservice maybe by not doing more on the ground research in terms of some of these ultra dwarf type new options for us? And I'd love to kind of hear from others on what that looks like, even on the field crop side or forages, etc. too.
I do agree with Molly on that. I think after seeing what the weather's been doing for the last 5 years, we've been watching it since 2015, 2014. Every year it's been different. We get hit with smoke. Some years we get hit with too much rain. Some years we get hit with too much heat. The weather has not been consistent. I think it is a race for new varieties and new genetics now, especially in the region that we're growing in. We got to change and we have to adapt. The only thing is we have to do it fast, and getting new varieties out, getting new genetics, it takes time. So now it's just how much time can farmers hold on to and plant these new varieties.
Yeah, I'm really glad that this rootstock conversation came up as well. I know several people have mentioned that lately in the tree fruit sector, in particular, that dwarfing rootstocks tend to have smaller rooting areas, and what does this do to their ability to access water? I was wondering, Mark, if there is anything that you would like to add when it comes to adaptation of the dairy or dairy varieties to these conditions. Is there room for that kind of adaptation in the dairy sector?
Well, not so much, I think, for the cows, unless you're going to start milking water buffalo, the heat. But as far as the forages, I think a lot of forages we grow in the Fraser Valley are meant for this climate in the valley. And I think with how the weather is changing, we're going to have to go to other places where it's drier and, you know, more arid and warmer, and maybe start bringing those varieties here, you know, more drought resistant crops and things like that to grow in the valley here, because it seems like that's the trend that's happening. It's getting drier and drier every year. And maybe plants that, you know, like we talk about root depth, roots just go down deeper so they can access the water.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it sounds like Doug has given some thought to that as well. Doug, you touched on this a little bit in your previous comment. Did you want to add anything?
Just that the old, I think it was called agriculture extension program. I think having somebody you can call in your area to actually work on your varieties or species or whatever it is we want to improve, I think that's very important. In our area, a lot of people will go to the local farm store and ask, "Oh, what are we planting this year?" But it's not a real knowledge-based answer that comes to those producers. So I think if somebody has to be leading edge and be able to tell a tree fruit grower or a rancher or whoever, this is a variety that's working in this condition, and this is what you should try, because it gets too expensive for us as farmers to try new varieties all the time and have to put all that effort into chasing down those varieties, because we're busy enough just looking after our ranches.
And especially if they don't work.
Yes.
You know, if the crop doesn't produce like you thought it would, that's a huge expense.
No, and that's what I had on my one crop that I had this year. It was one of the few years where I didn't really look at the variety and specifically say, this is the number of the variety I want, and it really came back and bit me. Like it was probably a 25-ton loss on a total on a couple of fields, and that really hurt on a year like this. So it's something that can be improved on, and definitely something government could help us out with.
It's a huge risk, and I echo both of your sentiments, especially when you come to a perennial crop like Amrit and I are growing. Now you're in for ideally a 25-year crop, which if you make a mistake or you choose the wrong variety or rootstock, it's compounded that much more severely over time.
Would you like to add anything there, Amrit?
Yeah, like Molly said, it's very difficult for us. It's just these crops that we plant, they're in the ground for 25 years. They're not cheap. The plant stock's not cheap to buy. When you make these kind of decisions on what variety to plant, you're thinking very long term. So whatever help we can get to make that decision would help a lot.
Okay, so it sounds like access to extension services, access to information that helps growers select varieties, rootstocks, seed sources, and know what is a worthy investment, whether it's a grass or a tree or a raspberry cane, would all be really, really helpful for all sectors. So that's, I think, again, a really useful lesson that we've learned here. I'm going to shift the discussion very slightly for my next question to raise something or to address something that a couple of you raised. The heat dome event that we experienced this summer, or that heat and drought, was really particularly acute in late June. So that was kind of a weird timing. But I'm curious to know from each of you if you would have been affected more or less acutely, or would have adapted differently if that timing of that event had occurred earlier or later in the season. Why don't we start with Mark?
Yeah, so for the cows, if the heat dome would have happened late July, August, it still would have been very hard on them, but they would have been more adapted to the heat. They would have had a couple months of dry, warm weather to get ready for that. So that would have definitely been easier on them, I think. And I think probably it would have been less humid, so it would have been drier air, I think, a drier heat than it was in late June. And also our crops, especially our corn crops, by the end of August, they're pretty much ripe and ready to harvest. We usually harvest in the, first couple weeks of September. So it wouldn't have damaged the crops nearly as much if it would have came at the end of August instead of, the beginning of June when they were just starting to form a cob. And same thing with our forage, our grass crops. We could have got probably an extra cut of grass off the fields before that heat came and really damaged the crops.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to hear from Doug if you made similar observations, Doug, that the early timing made it particularly difficult to deal with.
Yeah, the biggest issue for us this year was we went right from frost in middle of June, so we were late planting, and then it went so hot, so we didn't get that cover before the heat hit. As we plan for next year, if it's going to be another dry year, I would probably cut back my corn acres and go more of a mix annual crop of peas and oats and triticale, just so we can, as the drought progressed, we got shorter and shorter on water, and the corn did need water late in the season. Definitely, if the heat was later in the year, it probably would have been maybe a little bit easier for us to handle, just because we could have had that crop height to store the moisture a little better under the crop.
So again, interesting. There were some circumstances leading up to this heat dome that also kind of affected how you were able to adapt and what you were facing, which is very interesting. And I heard from a few apple growers, that's mostly where I work, that had a really funny positive effect of the COVID-induced labor shortages. And they found in their case that they weren't able to do the crop thinning as early as they would normally have done, which actually allowed them to go in after the heat dome and remove some of the heat damaged crops. So in that case, again, it was a funny circumstance leading up to the heat dome that provided some adaptation opportunities. In both your cases, Mark and Doug, you're talking again about, these weird circumstances that either constrain or enhance your ability to capture water or plant at the right time and keep going. I'd like to turn it over to Amrit next. Amrit, I'm going to present to you the same question. You sort of talked about this already, but if this heat dome had happened earlier or later in the season, do you anticipate that there would have been greater or less damage or changes in how you would have dealt with the situation?
For us, it kind of hit us at the worst timing. It was end of June. The berries were green, on the bush, which pretty much they were just ripening in the red stage for raspberries. The same goes for blueberries. Literally, the fruit got cooked. All the fruit that was on top of the plant or on the west side of the plant got cooked because they got sunlight for a longer duration through the day. We got probably about 40 to 50% damage in our raspberries. It didn't really make a difference, even if it came in before, we probably would have got some reduced damage, but the timing on it was worse. Even if it came later in the season, it still would have done the same amount of damage. The berries would have got cut. The UV was way too strong. The plants are just starting to collapse. They couldn't get enough water into the plants fast enough. Even though when we were checking our moisture in our mounds, we had about 20 to 30% moisture in the mound. But even then, the plants are just getting cooked.
Okay, so it was really a perfect storm for you and didn't give you much flexibility, really. Hopefully, if and when this occurs again, the timing won't be so awkward for the berry industry. I'd like to finish our set questions with turning it over to Molly. Molly, the timing, you've kind of addressed the timing a little bit in your answers before, but I'd like to specifically ask you if this event had happened earlier or later in the season, how would it have changed the amount of damage you imagine you got, and how would it have affected your ability to adapt and accommodate in the moment?
I think that if it had happened later, I think we would have probably had a more heat adapted crop generally. We generally have a hot, dry summer in much of our tree fruit growing region. And so I think we might have incurred less damage and certainly wouldn't have incurred the acute losses that we saw in the early varieties from the border sort of up until Kelowna and certainly in the Creston Valley with all of the lapins essentially being lost. So we might have been able to have a little bit less damage, and maybe the sunburn on the apples would have been further mitigated. One of the things that we saw this year when the smoke came in from the forest fires, it actually had a good side benefit for our apple producers in that it does reduce a lot of that sunburn potential going into the later part of the summer. And so I think that was a positive that came out of that. The interesting question to me is earlier. What would have happened if earlier? I'm worried that we might have had a total crop loss. I don't know what that would have looked like. If we'd had that extreme heat at blossom, would we have just blasted the blossoms? Could pollinating insects actually, fully do their job, go out and pollinate properly under those conditions? I have a lot of questions about that. We could have had a total crop loss in that case. I worry that kind of extreme heat might have also created a lot of other issues if it had been even earlier in the season. So, that's an area that it would be super interesting to hear from the climate scientists on, because I wonder what happens. And pollination, this year I didn't see great pollination in a lot of the orchards, and and there's always a weather effect to that. And we would, I think, it would be interesting to also look at that from a extreme heat point of view, which I'm sure there's folks working in that area.
Yeah, interesting. It seems to be a common theme with several of your answers. If it had been later, I think it would have been easier to deal with. Even the timing was pretty unprecedented and horrible, but if it had been earlier, maybe that would have been potentially even worse, which, well, let's hope we just stick with modeling to see what that effect would be, that we don't actually experience it in the next few years. Okay, so I'm scheduled in 10 minutes to switch to the audience questions, but we have so many questions that I'd like to switch a little bit earlier than planned. Before I do, does any one of the four of you want to add anything that suddenly occurred to you that you wished you'd said when you'd had a chance?
I just wanted to add one more point. The financial, I think us as farmers, we're very good at dealing with the day-to-day management, making the decisions on varieties and when we should plant and dodging around this weather. But I think the financial hit is what hit a lot of our BC ranchers. Because of the drought, a lot of people wanted to sell extra cattle, and because of that, the packing plants decided that they should make record profits this year. So you consumers were paying high prices for your beef. The packing plants were making really good money, but we really got hit in the fall. And I think that's something that'll actually really hurt our industry coming into the future, is that these bigger groups seem to take advantage of us as producers and not pay us when we need that extra little bit of payment to make it through the year.
Doug, that's an interesting point, and it's one that I've heard from other sectors as well, that financial considerations are really important, and we ultimately need to make sure that the producers are making a living wage regardless of the situation that happens from year to year. I'm hoping that there are conversations happening with policymakers to address these issues in the future. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to the audience questions now. There are already 18 of them, and I'm just going to work from the top down. I haven't really had a chance to read them yet, so I'm just going to read them as I go, and we'll see who they're addressed to as we hit them. Okay, so the first is, as a nursery producing food-bearing perennials, mainly hazelnut trees, primarily for BC farmers in a farming area that has water availability issues in a good year. Water availability is a huge issue that seems exceptionally important to address. I would agree with this. All four of you have raised it. While the heat was damaging, water is the most limiting factor for us. Many wells in our area dried up, and there's an increasing concern that farmers will not be able to obtain licenses sufficient for their irrigation needs. We have so much rain in the winter, so why is there not more focus on developing on-farm water storage for the dry months? And can we as farmers push more funding to support that? So I think particularly the last part of this answer is something that some of you might have something to say about. Is there something that farmers groups or individual farmers can do to encourage funding or programs to support the development of on-farm water storage or other practices that could be used to ensure water-related resilience in the future? I'm going to turn it over to any of you who'd like to answer.
I'll just answer that. That's definitely a struggle to look at irrigation storage and water licensing. And that's definitely something government has to step up to the plate and not give it to all the producers. Being a dam owner, it's hard to manage dams as development comes underneath your dam. The consequence of the dam goes higher, so your costs to maintain that dam go up as people move underneath the dam, and that should be passed on to government. And they used to have programs in the past where they would give you good interest rates to do irrigation development, and they've sort of backed away from that. So that's something that should be improved on.
Interesting. Thanks, Doug. Yeah, I think I can imagine that this will be a topic of conversation for a long time in the future. And I saw an interesting article in Country Life in BC a few months ago that addresses just this issue. So if people are interested in looking into it further, you could start by checking there. I have a question that I think will be interesting to hear from all of you an answer to, and that is, what is the biggest knowledge or research gap that limits your specific sector's ability to be able to be resilient, or adapt to other extreme events like this? Let's start with Molly. Molly, do you have in your mind what your biggest knowledge or research gap might be?
It's such a great question, because I think there's many places that we're struggling. I think as a whole, as an industry, we are probably not as efficient irrigators as we should be in tree fruits. And I think that's why I promote so much, trying to get information about using climate data and modeling and getting growers to really look at their soils and soil types. You know, I think this question around rootstock and variety is really important. And I think one of the observations I made this year, just in looking at my own place and looking at other growers' places, is that, you know, I think we have tried to push varieties and cultivars into areas where we haven't seen them grow before, and we've run into some really interesting problems, and even in our traditional growing areas have had issues this year. So, you know, I think there is a lot of research in that area that needs to be looked at. And, you know, I'm always promoting, like, I really enjoyed the discussion and hearing from the other producers, in that it got me thinking about, you know, my own cover crops and forages, and, you know, how can I also kind of cross-pollinate, use some of the work that is being done, you know, in the cattle sector, in the forage sector, in order to be able to pop that into my own orchard and do a better job of planning the resource use here. Because, you know, I have attempted twice now to plant a cover crop that's failed. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of work being done in other sectors. And I think that also is, you know, like Doug's comment about the grower doesn't have the time and energy to invest in that. And that's what I find is, you know, I'd ask for certain seed mix and just threw it in and realize later that that's maybe not the right approach. And so, you know, there's lots of work there that I think we can pull from other sectors and try to transfer that information.
That's really interesting, Molly. So now we're talking about communication across the border, and we're talking about intersector communication and how we could share information that's useful for everyone. I really like that comment. And I want to follow up next with Amrit. Amrit, do you have any additional thoughts or want to expand on anything that Molly just said? Things that have occurred to you in speaking to your colleagues about research gaps, the biggest research gaps that limit your ability to adapt to these extreme events, and how they could be filled?
For that, I think it's hard to say. It's just no one's really expected what we got, the heat dome that we got. No one's ever seen it. No one's really expected it. I think this is where the government's got to step in and put a lot of research into it and start looking into how they can help farmers adapt and change with the weather personally.
And it sounds from some of your comments before that things like exploring other varieties, speaking to growers in the South, looking at ways to deal with that intense UV that you mentioned, maybe those are all areas where the berry sector could benefit. Do you think?
Yeah, looking at like different companies around the world and what they're doing with new varieties and how they're making them better and they're releasing them to growers for different regions plays a big role with help farmers at the end of the day. Varieties is going to be a key thing, and you can see it. A lot of companies around the world, such as Driscoll, is investing a lot of money into new genetics and into new varieties for growers.
Yeah, interesting. That seems to be something that's come up from all four of you. So that's a really interesting point. I'd like to turn it over now to Mark. Mark, you have a really unique perspective in you know, the barns that you've already adapted and the different issues that you're dealing with. Not only do you have to grow crops to feed your dairy cattle, but then you also have to take care of the cattle. So you have a lot of things to balance. What are some of the factors or research gaps that you think are most critical to fill as you continue to adapt your operations to improve their resilience for the future?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. But I think personally, I think a great thing would be is to have some sort of like extreme weather drought conference, you know, and there could be, you know, every association there, you know, nurseries and berry producers and tree fruit producers and dairies and ranchers, and they could all go there and they could all work and go through workshops and to find different ways to mitigate, heat stress and drought on their farms, right? And learn about new research and new varieties and all that kind of stuff. I think that'd be a simple way for producers to go out and get information and bring it back to their operation and try to implement it. And I think that's going to happen sooner rather than later with the kind of weather we've been having. We're going to start having these conferences about mitigating the stresses of the heat and the drought.
I love this idea and I want to come. So sounds great. I'll be there and I'll take notes. Yeah. So in the absence of a really extensive, a really well-developed extension service, this is a way for that gap to be filled by communicating cross-sector, which sounds really cool.
Well, and also with the more pressure on
that's
producers.
Great. Did you want to add anything else, Mark?
Oh, just the one thing about like the added pressure on producers about climate change and usage of water and carbon footprint, all those things. I think as producers, we all want to be more efficient. We want to all have a less environmental footprint, right? And I think this is a way to help the whole economy, the whole country to lower our carbon footprint if we could be more efficient in different ways.
Yeah, that sounds great. And like you say, we all want to be more efficient. So it benefits our bottom line, it benefits the environment, and it really helps us maintain, relevance within the market. And it's really important for consumers, I think, as well. Doug, I just want to make sure that I still see you. I think we may have lost Doug. Oh darn! I wanted to ask him the same question, but if he comes back, we'll skip back to Doug. Okay, so we've addressed that question, and the next question actually is for you again, Mark, specifically. Rhonda Payne would like to know: did Mark's farm experience flooding? Is the lack of drainage a good story sometimes, but a bad story other times?
We did have flooding in our fields. Fortunately, never made it to our barns, but the flooding wasn't due to lack of drainage. It was just so much precipitation in such a short period of time. The drainage ditches around our property just couldn't keep up. All the ditches were full, so it wasn't a matter of no drainage. It's just the water couldn't leave soon enough.
Yeah, I think that in this case there was just so much rain. It's
and the
gotta
ground
go
was
somewhere.
sorry to interrupt, but and the ground was so saturated, it just had nowhere to go at that point. After the last 2 weeks of that rain, everything was just the water had nowhere to go.
Yeah, and I think some of Amrit's fields are dealing with flooding right now. I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that, Amrit.
No, just like Mark said, the ground is so saturated. Like, we got drain tile put in our fields. We got pumps pumping it out, but the ground got so saturated, you just couldn't do much.
Yeah, fair enough. Oh, I see that Doug is back on. Doug, can you hear me okay? I have a quick question for you if you can. Okay, I don't hear Doug. So, Doug, I'm going to watch for your mute sign, and if it does look like you're unmuted, I'm going to turn a question over to you. But in the meantime, I have a question for Molly. Molly, this is a question from Rhonda. She would like to know, what percentage more water did you use this summer? Was it 100% higher, 50% higher?
Thanks for the question, Rhonda. So really, this is kind of back of the napkin math. So it's not super precise. Let me frame it as well that I operate a 7.5 acre orchard on here, and I had planted an additional acre this year. So there is a bit of a new planting there, but my quick and dirty math showed about a 35% increase in the amount of water used this year over last year. still below the 24 inches that our irrigation district encourages, which I'm pleased about, but I'm pretty horrified by that number. And that 1 acre of new planting young baby trees on a T-tape drip tape really should not have accounted for that much increase. So it was just really interesting to me in terms of seeing the report come and seeing that increase in consumption. And it, like I say, I mean, take it with a bit of a grain of salt in terms of what that number actually means. But I think when we talked about timing, normally we would be sort of a full irrigation capacity on our system by July and August. And this year, that was happening by mid-June. So there was a full extra month of that much higher water usage than I normally would apply to the orchard. And I think that is likely what accounted for that increase for the most part. So I hope that, I'm not ashamed to share those numbers, but I think at the same time, I just want folks to think about it in the context. And, we're often criticized in agriculture, especially this year, when there was a lot of water restrictions domestically in town, in the area, rural areas, on people's lawns and gardens and stuff. So I want to, be sensitive about the discussion around that, because ag is a big water user, but this year it was really a matter of, wanting to get a crop to market and not lose our trees, which is our investment for future. And I certainly, want to, I want to be sustainable and conscientious of my usage, but this year it was much more of a case of I really couldn't afford to lose these trees either. So
that's really useful information, Molly, and it's a great point as well that year to year there are different challenges. If you've just freshly planted something, you really need to support it. And your answer also raised another question for me that I've heard from some people, that irrigation on and off dates may, kind of constrain growers from adapting in some cases, that, our growing seasons are becoming earlier and irrigation may be required at different times in the future. Do you see, do you hear from your colleagues the desire or potential need for that down the road?
To change the on-off dates, I mean, I think potentially there is. We've seen several years of challenges where either we've had a very early spring, let's call it, like an early bloom several years ago, where the crop needed water at early on. We like to get water on after the blossom in order to be able to support the crop development. And we've had years where that has not coincided with the normal irrigation startup time. And we've also seen, late season dry spells into the fall, where again, with the perennial crop, we often like to water that crop in order to provide some insulation for roots going into the winter, and to try to fill up that soil with moisture, and I think these are the things that we probably need to have a larger discussion about with our irrigation districts in my case, but also making sure that homeowners and the folks that are also sharing that water system are really understanding. And I like the collaborative approach of both ag and the urban area in order to make sure that we have support going forward for some of those extended, and extenuating circumstances, because we just don't know. And I'm concerned, and I say, unfortunately for Amrit and Mark and many producers who've seen a lot of waterfall this fall season, I'm worried about the interior, that we may not actually have had enough moisture to truly compensate for what was lost. And so that's an area that, may become again an issue next year is, are we going to start off the season again in a deficit? And I don't know what the answer is, but I have some concerns when I'm digging soil samples right now.
And Molly, again, you're touching then on that whole piece that has been raised by Mark, Doug, and Amrit about storing water in the future, whether that is creating water storage systems or even improving the organic matter content of the soil so that it is able to better hold on or capture or intercept the water that does fall. And actually, I'm wondering if anyone wanted to touch on that question that I just posed to Molly before I move to the next question. We're okay? Okay, then I'm going to move on to this next question. It's from Alfred. It's directed at Molly, but also the others. And Alfred says, we're discouraged from burning old woody debris during replants and try not to burn as per our environmental farm plan. So we chip and soil incorporate most of the old wood, hoping to immobilize that carbon. I feel we're essentially deferring our carbon emissions to later when late stage decomposition returns the carbon to atmospheric CO2. What other options do we have to recycle or remove our woody materials in a carbon sensitive way? Do you have any thoughts about that, Molly, or anyone else on the call?
This is really outside of my area of expertise. And honestly, Kirsten, you probably have done much more work on carbon in perennial systems than anybody. So, it is common practice for us to chip up wood waste and, we're certainly trying to keep a lot of particulate out of the air in the valley. And I haven't burned on this farm for the 15 years we've been here. So, but I just can't speak to the science on that. And I maybe want to turn that back to you.
I'll be happy to take it if anyone else, I'll give everyone else another chance first. Are there ways that you treat, for example, the residue from your plant crops that you use to try and incorporate or encourage soil carbon accumulation? No? Okay, I'll really quickly just touch on a little bit of research that Molly mentioned, that we found that any type of incorporating of organic material in orchards and vineyards, which is where I primarily work, does seem to help improve the amount of organic matter or carbon in the soil. It's true that eventually that decays, but it's just really useful to soil quality, soil health, soil nutrient cycling and water cycling to try and maintain the organic matter levels in the soil. One way to do that, as Alfred said, is to add the chipped pruning materials or wood waste materials onto the soil surface. And although a lot of that material will eventually degrade, if you continually input organic materials into the soil, then you'll always be maintaining that organic matter composition. Yes, a lot of it decomposes, but in the meantime, it's really supporting soil health and nutrient cycling and water holding capacity. So even if it does decompose, I think it still serves a useful purpose. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Anne. Anne says, we know what the short-term effects of the heat dome and drought were on food production in 2021, but what do you think would be the longer-term effects on, in this case, food-producing trees or shrubs? But I'd like to throw it out to everybody. Maybe let's start with Amrit. Amrit, do you think that there is any evidence of longer term damage that's going to take a while to recover from in raspberries and blueberries?
This is actually a very good question. It's actually a big unknown because what was it? It was Monday when the heat dome hit. Monday was like one of the last days, and that's when we started seeing our raspberry canes wilt around 4 or 5 p.m. They dropped their heads. They did bounce back, but we don't actually know the vascular damage that happened inside that cane. We won't know till next season. The same goes for blueberries. The plants were wilted, the leaves are collapsed. They did bounce back, but we don't know the internal damage that those plants have. How much bud set are they actually going to get this coming season? And pretty much, is there any internal damage to those plants? For raspberries, we can tell we have our canes are not as long as they should be. We're probably down by about easily 12 to 14 inches on cane length because of that heat. So going forward for next year, we really don't know, and we don't know how bad the damage actually went down to the roots if the roots did get damaged. So for perennial crops, it's a very big unknown because it's never happened before. So no one really has an answer for it.
So really, we have to stay tuned. I see Molly nodding her head. Would you echo Amrit's answer there, Molly?
Yeah, I think, there's so many unknowns with this. I was walking a cherry orchard here in Lake Country yesterday and just looking at the damaged wood, which really has a different appearance. It's quite white, it's streaked, it's not a normal sort of brown or even filled out nice, lush green sort of shoot. So I'm concerned about what some of that damage looks like. I mean, I think we didn't see the vigor in some of the plantings, like Amrit said, that we would have liked to have seen. A lot of growers also indicated, and I also witnessed this in my own new plantings, there was an absolute stop to the growth of young trees in June and early July. And then the vigor came late in the season. And a lot of the trees didn't shut down until well into October, which is concerning to me, especially we had really mild temperatures through October. I'm worried about the winter hardiness, and I'm not sure what that translates into in terms of, now we've got snow cover, but only just this week. And so will we have enough hardiness should we get a really cold snap? Which, 2 years ago, we had that extreme cold happen in the Okanagan, which took most of our cherry crop out. And I've seen that both in apple trees as well as the cherries that planted, that, it was a late dormancy. The other thing is, there's some strange physiological effects that happen with the heat, and fruit doubling can be a side effect, when buds are forming for the next season, especially again, cherries. Extreme heat can sometimes cause more doubling where, two ovules are stuck together. It's not really a marketable fruit product. So again, it's anybody's guess as to what the health and condition of those buds are heading into next year. And as I said to the grower yesterday when we were walking, we can estimate this crop today, but we have a long way to go before we see this crop on the trees, and many events could happen in the meantime. And if it's weak buds and maybe even a slight freeze is going to cause abortion of that fruit, I just don't know. So yeah, lots of questions for sure going into next year.
So essentially we need to watch and wait and pay really close attention. Yeah, that's interesting. And I've heard from my colleagues that things like drought and heat stress appear to cause unanticipated effects, for example, on susceptibility to disease. So yeah, we're just really going to have to pay close attention and see what happens. Mark, you touched on this question a little bit in your comments. I remember you were talking about the time it took for your dairy cattle to recover, for example, from the heat and start producing again. Do you anticipate any longer term effects? Was there any effects on the fertility of your cattle, on longer term productivity or milk quality, anything like that?
Yeah, fertility definitely takes a hit every summer in the heat. They're not as fertile. But with this extreme heat, what usually happens is cows are most comfortable when they're standing when it's really hot, because they could, breathe heavier and try to keep cool. They don't really like laying down so much. So if they stand for extended period of time, especially in like that heat dome, there could be lameness problems later on. We're starting to see a bit more lameness now, even though it's like 4 months, 5 months ago. It takes a while for that stress to come through onto their hooves.
Interesting. So again, it's a matter of watching and waiting, and there are really unanticipated effects down the road that we may be just starting to see now.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I see Doug is on the line, and I want to catch Doug as well. Doug, I'm curious if you also noticed or anticipate longer term effects on, for example, maybe the weight gain in your cattle or any other longer term effects that you're watching for now?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you perfectly.
Oh, good. It was interesting as in our fall season, with the thawing, melting and freezing, we had a little bit more we get some pine needle abortions. So that's cows eating pine needle runoff from trees or eating pine needles. And that was a thing that we lost a few more calves late in the season because of this mild temperature. And then another thing, like we do calve earlier in the year in February and March, which is kind of counter to what the YouTube farmers think we should do. Like they think we should be calving in April, May on grass, but that early calving, that allowed us to have our breeding season in May and June when it was still kind of cool. So our breeding percent of pregnant cows was still very good in spite of the heat. So as it gets hotter, we might have to, like you do have to calve a little bit earlier and deal with those snowy days, but it did pay off in having more bred cows in the summer.
Wow, interesting. I mean, this is such a new sector for me. It's really interesting to hear that these effects of the heat that I myself would never have anticipated, but it sounds like you have some strategies that ended up working fairly well for you. While I have you on the line, I see that there's another question specifically for you. An anonymous attendee would like to know, what strategies for extending your grazing season have you tried or are interesting in trying, considering the drought challenges?
We've tried just about everything. We've tried swath grazing in our area, and especially as we get warmer, it didn't really work because of that freeze-thaw cycle that we seem to get in the fall. The swaths were frozen down and then melted into the ground, and the cows made mud, so that didn't really work for us. We have done corn grazing, and it worked quite well, but then we did get some wildlife issues with that, and because corn is a good crop to harvest, we've gone to just, on these real dry years, we try to silage everything we can to make sure we have feed in our silage pit where it's available. Our biggest thing that we do is stockpiled grazing. So that's grass that either regrows throughout the season and is saved just for late fall, or it's grass that doesn't get grazed at all during the season and is just strictly grazed in that late summer season. This year we noticed with grasshoppers that we lost quite a bit of that grass. So we kind of went right from our third cut alfalfa, late fall grazing, and then we had to start feeding just because the grasshoppers had cleaned off our stockpiled grazing. So it's interesting as the temperature changes how your amount of forage changes as well, and you always have to adapt. And we're sort of wondering what next spring, because usually we start feeding on some pastures that have some old grass there, and we don't have as much of that old grass around for next spring. So that'll be a challenge that we'll have to deal with in the spring.
Once again, Doug, I'm glad you joined us again, because that's a really interesting answer. Again, while I have you, we have 2 minutes left, so I'm hoping that I can catch very quickly a little bit from all of you. But I see that there's a really interesting question about the smoke that we all experienced this summer. And I'm wondering if the smoke had big impacts, for example, on your animals. Did they struggle more?
I don't think we had too many issues with the smoke, other than it was just a little more depressing for me. And I think mental health is probably a biggest issue that came out of all that. But I think our cows did well. And in the heat, it was a little harder to get out and ride our horses and move cattle around just because it was so hot. So we had to let them spread out and maybe get into a little bit more trouble than we would like, just because of how hot it was and because of the smoky conditions.
Yeah, interesting. I think we were all pretty down this summer. Mark, how about you? Did the smoke affect your dairy cattle very much?
It's really hard to tell, actually. Maybe future, I'll see it in the calves more. I thought maybe the calves might needed more attention during that smoke. They got more respiratory problems, but it's hard to tell right now. The cows are pretty hardy, the mature cows, but the calves, I think, took a little bit of a hit.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And even down there, I guess it was smoky everywhere for all of us this year.
Yeah.
Molly, I know you'll have experienced the smoke. Did you see any major effects on your crop?
We didn't suffer too badly in terms of the crop condition, other than, one colleague had shared that where the forest fires actively burned right up to the orchard, they did feel there was some off flavors, which I think is much more common in the wine grapes than in the tree fruits. But like I said, the benefit of the smoke in one way was mitigating some of the potential late season sunburn. But we really suffered on the labor side because, of course, we're hand harvesting all of the fruit crops. We already were pushing very hard to pick at night wherever possible with the cherries in order to mitigate the heat effects on the fruit and on our people. And our harvest crews really had a difficult time with the smoke and, just being outside for an 8-hour picking day and suffering that way. So I agree with Doug's comment. I think the toll on us in terms of just, being able to get up and get excited to go out to the field is one of the hardest. And it's sure been a tough season on all producers, just mentally as well. So,
Yeah, agreed, Molly. Those are great points again. We're slightly over time, but I want to just give Amrit a chance um, to answer this question as well. Did the smoke affect you and your operation at all?
It did to a certain extent. It was more for our employees. We work long days during the month of June, July, and August. We're working, 14, 16, 18-hour days sometimes. So it was more just the guys getting tired, making sure everyone's hydrated, make sure everyone's got their water on all their harvesters. It did run into some issues with our equipment and our harvesters. Just it was harder for the harvester to get some air into it, so they were kind of overheating. But other than that, it wasn't too big. It was mainly just for our employees and making sure everybody was safe.
So once again, we see the benefit of talking cross-sector because again, here's another theme is that importance of mental health. And in this case, how the smoke really affected our ability to get out, to work, to stay safe, and to stay happy. With that, we didn't get to all the awesome questions that people posed, but I think we managed to touch on several really magnificent questions. And I guess it's now time to close. So I have a few important things I'd like to say. First, I'd like to thank our 4 fantastic panelists for sharing their knowledge and experience with us today. And also, I'd like to thank all of you for your tremendous participation. We'd like to acknowledge the generous support that has made it possible to hold these workshops annually. Funding for this week's workshop has been provided in part by an anonymous donor and in part by the governments of Canada and British Columbia under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is a federal, provincial, territorial initiative. Please join us tomorrow morning for our presenters and panelists on wildfire, risk, management, and recovery, and on Thursday for a discussion of carbon sequestration, potential to practice. I think several of you will be interested in these because I can see from the comments several questions related to these issues coming up. The login link for those sessions should be shared in the chat shortly. To stay informed of future BC Acorn events, please go to www.bcacorn.com. Thank you, Molly, Mark, Amrit, and Doug for your fantastic participation today. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you all in person in the near future. Thanks.